The following contact call excerpt is available at
ZEITZEICHEN.
Reader's request extract from the official 697th contact meeting of the 17th to 18th of December 2. Translated with deepl.com. Disclaimer: this is an unofficial translation. Source:
Figur ZEITZEICHEN.
105 on page 5 to 14.
But now hear what my father explained to you on Saturday, February the 17th, 1945, and what he recorded, but the whole thing is more extensive than what your actual questions refer to.
Edward, the main reason why I teach you in this time of shameful, bestial, horrible, malicious, completely destructive and fateful world warfare, I have already explained to you several times. But today I have a lot of important things to teach you, which on the one hand you have to align your life and your attitude to and learn a lot about. On the other hand, today I have much to tell you about the future of this world and its humanity, as well as the events to come. But first I want to give you an instruction that will accompany you through your life and be a part of your behavior. Edward, you must be powerful in your life, but you must never use your power abusively, not otherwise abusively, not complacently, not to rule others. To the contrary, you, and it will be your duty, will have to live your sense of responsibility, be modest and only creatively instructive, teaching, counselor, helpful, honest, peaceful, and proclaiming. With your power, you will fight for everything with right and just means in a peaceful, just and right manner and with clear reason and just reason, in order to bring about real good, even when you will be insulted by evil adversaries against better knowledge with slander to the contrary. Many of these adversaries will be believers in Christ, who will believe that they are above creative reality and truth, because their faithful religious faith as well as their senses and aspirations are grotesque and therefore strangely and ridiculously oriented towards a God imagined by people of this world. The German name God corresponds to multiple alterations, transformations and changes of the oldest term Gudana, which originates from the original language of the universal Kandanokodemion and means creation, in which the meaning creation and universe is fundamentally anchored. The term Gudana was brought into this world about 13,500 years ago, after which it was changed into many languages over the millennia, converted and used for an imagined higher power. As a result, the actual meaning and value of the word also underwent a complete change, whereby people devised an entity for the original meaning creation or creation and universe, which was to be responsible for the creation of the world and heaven. So the term Gudana was transformed into a completely false meaning of a higher entity, which found its way into the earthly languages as God. Although there are still other forms of origin of the term God, but when it was brought to this world before primeval times, from the very beginning, then also in much later times, variations, abbreviations and changes arose in various languages of the people of this world. In the north of the world, for example.
Note by Ptaah. Europe.
There were abbreviation changes like Go, Guda, and in other languages and changes also Guth, God, Good, and Got, as originally in other countries Alan, Dawn, On, Manu, Siwan, Kut, Caught, and Go Caught, etc., with which different meanings were connected, which however in the end always pointed to a creating power and being, which was personified after human ignorance and in a further and last change of concept was called God and finally conceived as God Creator. But if now in the understanding of the term God in today's time in every linguistic usage thought back and thought, understood and used in its origin as creation, and universe, then it can be used in this sense in a correct way, but actually only in the understanding of this sense, but never in the form of a religious belief of a confused religious doctrine, by which in each case only and always a worshipping Creator God and God the Father is meant. Also a human being can justifiably be described with the term God if he possesses and cultivates the predominant character trait of love, and thus for him the well-being of human beings is the highest priority. In this sense, to be able to call a person God means that his commitment in every conceivable relationship for other people and all living things.
Note by Ptaah. Total nature, fauna, flora and universe
must be the highest thing he can accomplish in love. So his love cannot be an emotional love, but only a living and acting love that gives everything. The term God for a human being also requires self-sufficiency from him, and through his being justice and moral equality, goodness and mercy, forbearance, understanding and all beneficial qualities must also be given for his fellow human beings. Also, if a person is to be called God, he must be imaginative, inventive, industrious, imaginative, artistic, imaginative, helpful, beneficial, honest, compassionate, peaceful and successful, as well as productive, rich in consciousness, musical, intelligent, creative, gifted, ingenious, witty, original, active, educational, talented, knowledgeable, constructive and effective, etc., and he must live righteously as well as creatively and creatively, which in no way has anything to do with a higher power of creation, nor with a confessedly religiously imagined Creator God, nor with creation respectively creation and the universe. The possibility of the existence of such a human being would be a state of highest possible perfection, which may be possible in the infinite celestial distances.
Note by Ptaah. Universe.
With very highly developed humanities with very isolated humans, but will not be the case on this world.
Note by Ptaah. Earth.
Even beyond unimaginable times. Through degeneracy of faith, people have already at very early times also fallen into thoughts, emotions and degenerate forms of behavior, through which other people were persecuted, murdered and also peoples were war-torn, if they were of a different faith than those who were out for hatred and revenge. The different nature of the various groups of people also played an important role, as did the food for which they fought. Out of all this, unspeakably many evils were born which formed themselves as vice, imagination, surge, envy, excitement, hatred, greed, false expectation and confused hope, passion, anger and rage, intoxication, hysteria, exuberance, restlessness and overexcitement of all kinds. Everything also produced wild fantasies, delusions, illusions and confused delusions that became more and more profound and ended in a pathological delusion of faith that ultimately formed religions. For many thousands of years, the madness of the only very small and diverse religions has thus sworn by oath to an unreal God invented by man, who at first was regarded only as an illusion, animal, object, sun, man or moon, etc., but in later times as God who is supposed to sit on a heavenly throne and who was raised absurdly to a creator God by the believers in God of all times. This non-existent and man-invented God is attributed by those who believe in him to have created the universe and the heavenly bodies as well as everything at all, to have created love itself and to be forgiving and just, but at the same time he demands punishment and even death for mistakes made and makes men responsible for their weaknesses and imperfections, although he is supposed to determine all actions and deeds of men himself. But the case is different from what the believers in God assume, because not one God has invented and created men, but they have invented this God and invented the fantasy and deception that they worship and worship in their confusion. They have become deluded and lost themselves to this fantasy being, which from the beginning was the reason why, as I said, they have fallen into envy, vices, excitement, imagination, surges, hatred, false expectations, greed, hopes, passions, anger and rage, intoxication, hysteria, tension, unrest and overexcitement. This prevented them, and continues to prevent them today and in the future, from becoming independent and blameless, self-responsible, peaceful, self-aware, strong in character and blameless, etc., as well as from achieving true humanity. And this is what the people of this world have done because they have made themselves incapable, and still do today, of governing themselves and living without illusions and without divine delusions through their malice and viciousness. So they delusionally created an unreal God and thus a supreme being that corresponds to their needs. Thus they have created the necessity God's existence for themselves and firmly believe in it. Every rational human being makes a good face of it as an evil and erroneous game, while the believers in their confusion believe that their invented God receives their prayers, signs acts and helps them in need and misery. The truth, however, is that every believer only uses his God of faith as a pretext for the stupidest claims and for his guilty conscience. And so also wars are started in his name and revolutions are waged, murders are committed and even punishments are punished with death. According to their needs, the believers in God turn their God into what they want and what he is useful for. But the throne of this man-invented God will start to wobble because in the coming times many believers will fall away from him because they will no longer have the desire to continue to play a believing role for an invented God who will increasingly become a comic figure. The alleged power of God and thus the God monarchy will be abolished by many people in the coming times, and it will be these who will one day strive for real peace, and who will scorn the strife and warfulness, all evil, all degenerate evils of men, and who will ultimately no longer invoke and worship the God invented by confused men as the representative and supreme authority of all powers of an obsolete and delusional faith. Much can also be explained with regard to the power of men in general, as well as that which has been the greatest evil of men since time immemorial, namely that they strive for power selfishly and for their own purpose, and control their fellow men, rule over them and want to elevate themselves above all others. They develop an obsession with power that knows no boundaries and leads to vicious, degenerate violence, human bestiality, wars, intrigues, murders, bloodlust and all kinds of degeneracy. And for many reasons this began with men already in primeval times and has remained until today, whereby innumerable people have been bestially murdered and humanly created values of many forms destroyed and even irrevocably destroyed, as well as unspeakable suffering, misery and great misery, and ever-increasing hatred and revenge campaigns against those who for some confusing reasons were considered enemies have arisen. And that has so remained until the present time and will still be carried on into the distant future, whereby power-obsessed and vengeful men push themselves into the authorities and, when they have reached their desired positions of power, exercise their greed for power. In so doing they instigate wars, conceive punishments and decrees in order to spread death and ruin and to remove disagreeable adversaries from the world, just as they oppress the populations with all sorts of inadmissible laws and exploit them through highly exaggerated tax levies in order to enrich themselves with them on the one hand, or in order to squander the revenue senselessly and still accumulate debts. For a power-obsessed person, power is not a means to a good purpose, but a degenerate end in itself. Normally, power is what makes it possible to create something valuable. So man needs power in order to be able to make an impact, but since time immemorial people have abused it for selfish, violent, destructive and fatal purposes and have brought unspeakable misery and destruction to the Earth's population, including genocides and the extermination of peoples.
Note by Ptaah. Genocides.
As was the case with the Nazi regime in the Third World War, which is currently still ongoing. The Nazi leader Adolf Hitler is also infested with an unbridled obsession with power, and he exercises his criminal and inhuman power for the sake of power, whereby tens of millions of people have already been killed in acts of war, as well as many millions of innocent Jewish members of the faith have been murdered as a result of hatred of the Jews. And such extermination mass murders of believers of other religions.
Note by Ptaah. Religious genocides.
And their splinter groups.
Note by Ptaah. Sects.
Have been carried out since time immemorial through wars and horrible massacres, but this has continued to this day and will continue to do so. Already in a few decades the same will happen again in a very bad way by a religiously degenerated horror brood.
Note by Ptaah. Terror organization is Islamist State.
Starting from Arabia and then spreading worldwide, man's obsession with power is so degenerate in this world that countless are willing to do anything for their power, even over countless human lives to be murdered. Thus mankind must ensure that if one or the other obsession with power is recognized, providences.
Note by Ptaah. Precautionary measures
are taken to stop such power-hungry people as far as possible. And this must always be done before the power-obsessed can reach the offices of the authorities and seize power and exercise their dictatorial, power-hungry tyranny, usually with the help of like-minded people and by bribing those who are maliciously influenced and morally also degenerate. Often people also apply in offices of the authorities and in politics, which are good-minded because they are willing to do something good. But then when they come to power, then power also gradually becomes an end in itself with many of them. Consequently then greed for power also breaks through with them. The inevitable consequence then is that they develop a form of power of violence for the attainment, preservation and domination of people and peoples, in which they are entitled to any means, independent of morality and law, in order to exercise their power and achieve their desired goal of domination. If there are people in an environment who are perceived as greedy for power, however, it must always first be well considered and correctly judged whether there is a real greed for power, because it is often customary among people to attribute it to other greed for power, which, however, is not so, but which basically mean well and also work, act and are prepared to do good things for the good of their fellow human beings, just as they also know how to accept and bear responsibility. Therefore, it must always be checked what people's concerns are at all. But when people seek and exercise power for the sake of power and prestige, this corresponds to a dark and sinister greed for power that brings violence, bloodshed, oppression and, as a rule, murder and manslaughter, revolts, wars and destruction. If therefore people seek this kind of power and are also prepared to deceive, to wage war, to commit murder, killing and oppression, and to use other criminal means without conscience, then this is to be described as degeneration and greed for power. And this should and should not be tolerated by men with any other man, but everyone and the whole human community would have to defend itself against it with intellect and reason by using non-violent means. And in this way everything should be brought to the attention of the public by just means, explaining and acting, in order to prevent the power-obsessed from not being able to reach the power of the authorities and neither being able to realize nor live out their desire for power. For man to have and exercise a sense of responsibility means to always and in every case always achieve a good thing, to commit himself to a good and right thing, and to know that everything must always and in every case be achieved in a good and peaceful way, and placed in an acceptable good position of responsibility. People must assert themselves in a peaceful, just way with a clear mind and healthy reason, without any power behavior, even when they are in leading positions and have to lead and guide their fellow human beings. Everything must be good and orderly, and there must be nothing bad to contribute, because the sense must always be for a good cause, just as the means must always be good and lawful, and those responsible, as well as all people in general, should never go over dead bodies, not even in the figurative sense. That for now so far, but now to where I come from, because I have not yet told you that. But you yourself have noticed that I am not earth-born, but that I come from afar from another world. This is very far from the earth, and also in another spaciousness.
Note by Ptaah. Dimension.
Outside of what you see in the sky with all the stars.
Note by Ptaah. Universe.
And where I have already led you out into the space of heaven to contemplate the near worlds.
Note by Ptaah. Sol system planets.
With my flying machine, is only this heaven.
Note by Ptaah. World space of this dimension.
For the other spaciousness from which I come is present far beyond this space of heaven. You are not yet able to grasp this, but through my teachings with other terms you will understand in a few days with what I have inspired you to reflect with my presentation. You will also learn even more, as well as now that I have to explain to you that my home in the other space belongs to a structure of stars.
Note by Ptaah. Star cluster.
Which we call Pleasure. But you must hide this name if you already begin your task in the next few years and your first literary task works.
Note by Ptaah. Written missionary work.
Will begin to spread, and it will be very important that you keep silent about my origin as well as about the origin of my aircraft. Your silence will be of great importance, for if you become known in the world by name and through your dealings with me and all my followers, much lies, deceit and slander will arise from malicious, charlatan and selfish people who, on the one hand, will lie to be liaisons with me, my followers, or, on the other hand, with some fantastic heroes of other worlds.
Note by Ptaah. Extraterrestrials.
Who will be cunningly invented by them. This is the reason why during the next decades you may not call our name Pleasure, but in your speeches and written publications only the name Pleiadian, which refers to the structure of stars in this celestial space.
Note by Ptaah. Universe.
In which also the Earth orbits around the Sun. These are still young and inanimate star formations, which on Earth are also called Atlantids, Atlantids, 7 stars, 7 sisters and Glocken.
Note by Ptaah. M45,
and which are part of the galactic system of this celestial space, which the inhabitants of Earth call Milky Way. If you speak and write about Pleiadian instead of Pleiadian, then liars, deceivers and slanderers will expose themselves, because their claims to be connected with beings of the Pleiadian or with other beings of other foreign worlds become untenable, although your adversaries first thoughtlessly call them so-called true contactors. Those, however, who will lie that they would be in direct or indirect connection with us players, will then be convicted of the lie by you, if my successors instruct you to name our true origin at the given time, namely the star formations of the players, according to which we also call ourselves players. And our spaciousness exists far beyond the Pleiadian of this present celestial spaciousness. The lies, deceptions, and slander by many malicious, charlatan, and selfish people around the world will come in 7 years, and thus in 1952, when you will have followed my instructions and sent a letter to various media, military, and government officials in the United States of America and the Soviet Union together with Pastor Zimmerman in 3 years. I will draft the letter in English myself, which you will then have to hand over to Reverend Zimmerman, after which he himself will make a copy and necessary copies of it and send it, as he has already instructed me to do, in larger numbers to the authoritative recipients in the United States of America and the Soviet Union. He will find the necessary addresses at the appropriate time, but you and he will be obliged to remain silent in this matter. This will have to be done in order to inform the important people of the authorities and the military forces what it was and is about with regard to all the aircraft unknown to them, which have been observed around the world in the past and also during the World War II, which are called Foo Fighters, our future.
Note by Ptaah. From the future.
And also come from foreign worlds, but which will also continue to appear in all future times. As early as 1952, this will lead to the spread in the United States of America, through malice, charlatanry and selfishness, of the first cunning lies, deceits and slander regarding alleged connections of Earthlings with beings and aircraft from Venus and other foreign worlds. And this will continue in this way for many decades up to the 3rd millennium and will remain so, whereby your real connection with me and those who follow me will be shamefully abused by adversaries, and you will be accused around the world of lies, deceit and charlatanry, and will also be physically attacked and have to reckon with attacks against your life, even from your own ranks, for you will found a community with many co-workers, malicious betrayals against you, and your work will result from long-time confidants, and even from your own family, or from stupidity, hatred, selfishness, self-love, egoism, unfulfillable lust for power, as well as from self-assertion, imprudence and false trust. Those afflicted by hatred, envy, other evil-minded adversaries, religious believers, as well as the media, will cause worldwide a malicious, wicked and against you and your connection with me and my successors a slanderous and contentious debate and controversy, in which your spouse, who will never be a real companion to you, and one of your sons will unscrupulously reach out her hands to you. And when I talk about it, I also associate it with your future, which will bring you much joy and suffering with female beings, but which will strengthen you and make you fit for life. Already as a young and also as an adult man you will be captured and desired by many young and older femininities, but this will require much resistance from you in order to preserve and keep your dignity and honor, to go your ways and to adhere to the moral order. And in order to strengthen you in this way, I will teach you from the point of view of morality, virtues and ethics how a female person will do this after I leave, and then teach you in this way as well. This will also teach you to be very selective in relationships and in dealing with femininities, and to end a bond more likely when a demand arises that transcends comradely familiarity. So it will be that you will then avoid such a request and urge and not be to will, but give up the relationship and go on alone again if you're nonsensual.
Note by Ptaah. Nonsensual, platonic, non-bodily.
Behavior is not understood, but you will also experience much sorrow and grief when, as a young man, you find a loving companion in each of two foreign countries, for twice happiness will never hold you for a long time and fate will separate you again through misfortune and death. After that you will enter into a longer relationship in your home country and travel together through some European countries, but your companion will deceive you after some time and do this again and finally leave, after which you will go your own way again. Then you will find another companion in a foreign country, whom you will be fond of in love. But also this short happiness will not be lasting for you because through shameful human trafficking your plans will be destroyed and you will again be alone. But over a number of years you will cultivate in your homeland a loving nonsense friendship with a young companion, who you always come together when you return home from your wanderings through the world. After many years, however, when you marry in a foreign country, you will also lose sight of each other. Then it will be another time that you will experience great suffering when you find another loving companion in a foreign country, but you will also lose her through death, after which it will happen that you will also be struck by a serious misfortune in a foreign country and lose your left arm. Then comes the time when you will trust and marry a young girl in another foreign country, but this will not bring you happiness, but only a lot of suffering, joylessness, discord, damage to your health, and many years of dispute, because this spouse will not be a loving companion, but an unseemly person full of indignation and annoyance, burdened with lust for power and quarrelsomeness, and with spite and dishonesty. But you will stand with her and give birth to a daughter and 2 sons with her, before she will openly betray you and your work, and will go her own ways divorcing herself from you. But all this must be done so that you may also learn perseverance and resistance to much evil, innumerable offenses, insults, lies and slander, to which you will be exposed by hateful, malicious, deceitful, insidious, double-tongued, malicious, wicked, cunning, lying and disfavorable adversaries all over the world. If you begin your work openly, carry it out into the world. So you need very strong resistance and willpower, because you will be exposed to excessive attacks against your honor, honesty and dignity, which will also lead to attacks against your life. Therefore you have a lot to learn, also with regard to the development of a sensitive sensory perception, through which you will be able to perceive warning inner impulses.
Note by Ptaah. Vibration impulses.
In case of danger and will be able to protect you from damage by appropriate behavior. Be exposed to years of your life. So you must learn to stand up to everything and become strong and capable. And only then, when you learn everything, will you be able to accomplish your difficult task and parry all the malicious attacks in the form of nagging and disapproving critics. You will also learn to ignore all the countless lying, untenable and slanderous reproaches, hostilities, insults, abuses, and also all the attacks and hostilities that arise against your life, your honor, dignity, integrity, trustworthiness and decency. So you will also be instructed by me to behave in a logical and correct manner, whereby silence will very often be the best weapon against bitterly evil slander and disparagement, whereby you will also have to keep yourself in the background during your work as a whole and not display a sense of publicity.
Note by Ptaah. Synonym offentlicum after etten.
In view of everything often very serious that you will experience in your life, I have to prepare and teach you over the next few years so that you can actually develop your joy and dignity of life, never lose it again and never despair. And you will need these abilities to be able to pass them on to many people who will need your help, because they will lose their purpose in life, but will find it and their confidence in life again through your help. But now I have to explain further what will happen later in your life, when you will have long since spread your work through scripture and word in many countries, for which I have to open to you that after the divorce and departure of your wife, who is incapable of love, but is quarrelsome, you will find a meeting place with like-minded people.
Note by Ptaah. Center.
Will join you in deep love with a loving young ally and confidant and will accept a son as her own, whom she will bring into connection with you. This will finally be your life's wife and real, very loving life's companion in an unmarried way. Even more than all that I have told you so far, and everything that I have to explain now and later, I will only briefly mention today, because all the comprehensive connections of the explanation still to be mentioned and explained with regard to many things, events and occurrences etc., which will come to you in your life and which will be far-reaching as well as deeply formative events are so extensive, unusual and often tragic that I will have to explain them to you in detail at a later point in time, because you can only really understand and learn to cope with everything in every necessary way by carrying out all things in their entirety. I also have to explain that the 11 years you will spend with me teaching in this present level will never be enough to learn everything so that you can be prepared for everything necessary in your life and for your great task. So we have to extend the time by years, which will also be in connection with my succession, which will take you into its care after I leave. But this can only happen by controlling and shifting time.
Note by Ptaah. Manipulate.
And using it, as I have done several times with you since 1942 and have let you observe and see various countries, many significant, interesting, instructive things and also several theaters of war and war events etc. This will cause you to get older all the time. The years will be, of course, but this will not have a strong effect on your body, because despite your additional times in other levels of other heavenly spaces.
Note by Ptaah. Other dimensions or space-time structures.
You will age, but your youthfulness will remain until your age. Likewise, if you continue your learning with those who follow me in commitment for longer or shorter periods outside the present level in levels of the past or future, it will be like this. And everything that has been done so far in this way has been inevitable for your learning, your personal development, and for your future hard work, which has much more to do with different conditions, qualities, problems, subjects, circumstances and connections etc. than a person of this world and your age could usually learn, understand and cope with. Even for the great mass of humanity on this earth, it would be impossible to learn, experience all of this and to process it sensibly without becoming mad, as you have to do. But all of this is relentlessly necessary for you, which is why we must continue to use the times of the past and the future, because only then will we gain long enough times.
Note by Ptaah. More years.
Which we can use for your learning. So it must be that I lead you away from the present for more or less or longer periods of time, which can be days, weeks or months, during which you have to learn strictly, after which I bring you back at the same time to the present time from which I took you away. In this way you will not be missed by your parents and siblings, nor by anyone else, nor in school, because through the control and shifting of time.
Note by Ptaah. Time manipulation.
It will be that you will always be present in the present plane and at the time prevailing here. And this must be so, because the 11 years in this present level alone would never be enough to teach you all that you have to learn. You will, of course, age around the times when you learn in other periods outside the present time that prevails here in this world, but you will still remain youthful into old age. With this I have given the first necessary explanations, but further I must instruct you that in the coming times you must warn humanity on earth of further threatening and great dangers, which will threaten the world and humanity even after the end of this war in the coming month of May. The greed for power and domination, the vindictiveness and the vile irresponsibility of the government rulers and the military rulers of the United States of America will completely wreck and devastate 2 large cities in Japan by novel bombs with tremendous destructive power. Hundreds of thousands of people will be killed in the process, so that this still raging world war will only really come to an end in the Far East. Even if you do not yet understand what such a bomb is about, which is also called an atomic bomb along with other names, I will briefly explain to you what it is about. Later I want to inform you more about it, but today I want to explain to you that these bombs are based on a principle of atomic fission. This means that the atom is split, which is considered to be the miniest and even the smallest particle that can allegedly not be split, as has been misconstrued since time immemorial. In fact, however, this assumption does not correspond to reality, because the atom is fissile, under which another 6 particle planes are assigned to the natural planes. The process of atomic fission is also referred to as nuclear fission and belongs to a process of nuclear physics, in which an atomic nucleus is separated into 2 or more components under an enormous release of energy. When an atomic bomb is detonated, an uncontrolled chain reaction takes place, with the number of nuclear fissions increasing rapidly and in enormous numbers, releasing unimaginable amounts of energy in an explosion, killing, destroying everything that falls within its explosion range and destruction wave range. That is what I have to explain to you for the time being with regard to this dangerous bomb, whereby I will make you observe from my aircraft the first of these dangerous and deadly events. But back to the still continuing World War, which has been going on since 1939 and will only come to a terrible end in Europe in May of this year 1945, while in the Far East this will only be in August, after American atomic bombs have criminally destroyed 2 Japanese cities and killed hundreds of thousands of people. This World War, and I have to explain this, is not the second global war, as is claimed, but the third, because the first was already waged in the years 1756 to 1763. But now all the great powers and many other countries of the 20th century are involved in this world war, and this event represents the greatest military conflict in the history of mankind in this world. But the end of this war will not also be the end of hostilities, because it will also continue after this still ruling war as it has since time immemorial. After the collapse of the Nazi Empire, the United States of America will let itself be proclaimed the sole victor in the world in its autocracy, and will continue to maintain its hostility towards the Soviet Union. This will lead to a very dangerous situation, which will be called Cold War, which for about 50 years will constantly threaten a new war of the great powers and a further use of atomic bombs, also on the part of the Soviet Union, where as a result of espionage nuclear weapons will also be developed, as will later also be the case in several other countries. Also until well into the third millennium there will be year after year around the world many dozens of insurrections, revolutions, civil wars, international wars, hate and government collapses etc., whereby, as always -80% of always deceitful intrigues, machinations, interferences, Secret Service actions and acts of violence of the United States of America will lead to it. And as they have done since time immemorial, they will continue to ignore the self-government and independence of foreign countries, interfere in their affairs in an autocratic and power-obsessed manner without being asked, and will not shy away from politically induced assassinations and evil armed violence. Thus the future will be such that large parts of the whole world will be more and more dominated by the power of America, and the American hostility towards the Soviet Union will be maintained, which on the one hand has always been marked by a cowardly fear of the powerful of the United States of America, but on the other hand by their greed for power to bring the Soviet Union under American rule, and to promote enmity against the Soviet Union among the American people and the American-friendly countries, as will later be done against the newly emerging Russia. The ruling rulers of the United States of America will do all they can to advance the arms industry, and this will be done in order to then supply the countries which are stirred up against the Soviet Union and later against Russia by American-induced enemy propaganda, with large masses of ever more modern war weapons and other war material, in the sense that these are to be used against the Soviet Union and later against Russia, and speculating possibly also against China, if a further world war provoked by the United States of America should be triggered. In this way, early and very secret precautionary plans already exist among the American government elite, which are to be continued into the future, when the still continuing World War will be ended by a horrible murder and destruction scenario with very dangerous bombings in Japan in the coming month of August, whereby, however, still much greater war risks, fear and terror will be released with the whole world population than this was so far ever the case. This will remain so even then and carry itself into the third millennium, when the Soviet Union loses its communist power in almost 50 years, then also falls offside in the economy as a whole, and as the Soviet Union is transformed into one. And this danger and the fear and terror of all mankind of another global war will reappear in the third millennium through the guilt of the United States of America, because they are also engaged in hostile agitation against the new Russia, and will incite and drive America-friendly countries to Russia hostility. On the other hand, this will also lead to hostilities in other countries against the United States of America, which will be harassed in some form by American interference, and thus become dangerous archenemies. At the same time, as the Soviet Union draws to a close and a new Russia emerges, a Union dictatorship will be established in Europe.
Note by Ptaah. European Union's dictatorship.
And bind many European countries to themselves, whose leaders and populations allow themselves to be integrated into the deceitfully and lyingly peaceful, liberal and unifying dictatorship, which gives and calls itself, but is really European's dictatorship, and is exploited by it through large annual financial contributions. But after years the truth will turn out to be that everything is just lies and deception, and will break through the true nature of the Union dictatorship, and internal discord will arise. If the dictatorship will also demand high taxes from the member states for nonsensical things, such as the necessary use of plastics and all sorts of other materials, utensils and consumer goods, etc., to enrich the dictatorship, when leaders and populations will revolt against the subjugating machinations of the Union dictators, which will then, in one case or another, also take into account exclusions from this dictatorship, and the unreasonableness of certain short-thinking, inexperienced, unwise, uncritical and unneeded rulers and parts of the Swiss population who are incapable of judging facts will also make it impossible for them to fall into the clutches of the Union dictatorship, which is constantly and increasingly applying repression and forcing Switzerland to commit itself more and more to treaties in favor of the Union dictatorship. This will drive Switzerland ever more viciously and with coercive regulations ever closer under the domineering fox of this dictatorship, whereby Switzerland together with its population will lose many freedoms, whereby then compulsorily only according to the laws, guidelines and contractual regulations of the Union dictatorship may be acted, and finally also neutrality will be questioned. And it will be the case that the responsible rulers of Switzerland, who will conduct negotiations with the rulers of this Union dictatorship, will irresponsibly bow to the unfree and dictatorial demands of the treaty, and thus drive their own homeland and the population more and more into membership with the Union dictatorship. It will also be the case that the member states of this dictatorship with large financial dictatorship contributions will be unheard of exploited, as in the course of time Switzerland will also be financially exploited. This is because, through the ignorance, unreasonableness and irresponsibility of leading and competent rulers, as well as that part of the people who will live in a state of abandon and support the Union dictatorship, Switzerland will pay high millions and billions to the Union dictatorship in order to maintain, promote and guarantee the cohesion between the dictatorship and the individual member states.
Note by Ptaah. Cohesion payments.
This would turn Switzerland into a dictatorship, hearing and burdened financial vassal state of the Union dictatorship. It will also emerge, as explained, that the member states of this dictatorship are being exploited to an unheard of extent by large financial contributions. The same will apply to Switzerland if, as a result of the ignorance, unreasonableness and irresponsibility of leading competent rulers and the ignorant part of the people, the repressive demands of the Union dictatorship are advocated. Switzerland and its population are thus financially exploited and harassed and deprived of independence by Union dictatorship laws and creeping and insidious dictatorial rules, decrees and regulations. And this will happen when untraveled or dictator-friendly negotiators of the country as well as the unneeded part of the people let themselves be blinded by the dictatorship rulers, and they will submit to the insidious demands of the Union's coercion against the will of the thoughtful and reasonable Swiss population by means of anti-freedom resolutions, unfair treaties and constraints. Only if the people of Switzerland counteract these actions of those responsible but irresponsible rulers by means of popular decisions, who in their innocence allow themselves to be deceived by the rulers of the dictatorship, will it be possible to prevent Switzerland from becoming a submissive vassal state of this Union dictatorship. But if those responsible for the country and the unreasonable part of the people will not be attentive and let themselves be deceived by the dictatorship's despotism, then it will inevitably happen that, as will happen in the whole world among many peoples through the work of America, an extremely unsatisfactory state will develop between this Europe-wide dictatorship and Switzerland. And it would be just as damaging to the neutrality of the country as it would to its peace and freedom if Switzerland negligently and recklessly bowed to the dictatorship, as it would to the population. If this were really to happen, then, at the behest of the Union dictatorship, freedom of information, opinion and the press would ultimately be restricted, just as dictatorial machinations would also undermine the order and laws of Switzerland and make it an in-bondage vassal state. In addition, the free provision of information, which will be guaranteed by law in the future, and the Swiss government's duty to provide information would be suppressed and prevented in such a way that the population would no longer be informed about certain actions, treaties and machinations etc. in connection with the Union dictatorship, but that everything would be handled and controlled secretly by the government. And this would be done in the same way as it will be the case early on in the administration of the Union dictatorship itself, which on the one hand will strike secret machinations and on the other will deceive the countries and populations of its Union dictatorship and in every respect bring them under its direct control. And if Switzerland were to be affected by it, then the discontent and dissatisfaction of the Swiss people would break out and possibly disrupt peace and freedom in the country to such an extent that it could lead to nationwide resistance and civil war. And it would be like when in 1918 a nationwide domestic political crisis threatened and the Federal Council deployed the army of more than 100,000 soldiers equipped with machine guns in order to proceed unscrupulously against the striking population with malevolent force and to accept many dead. If the nationwide strike could not have been broken off and the people could not have been forced to surrender with threats. But as in the whole world also in coming times, and also in the new millennium no real peace and no true freedom will be, but far around again and again threats of war and acts of war will intimidate and frighten mankind, contrary to all understanding and all reason will be continued in the hitherto existing traditional delusion of the power-obsessed and the mass of the accompanying needy in the nations. At the forefront in the third millennium, as since time immemorial, the danger of war incitement will emanate particularly strongly from the United States of America, which will create discord and unfreedom worldwide and try to bring more and more countries under its absolute control. And it will then continue to be the case that through the machinations of the Union dictatorship, Switzerland will take damage to neutrality and its population will fall more and more into discord and lack of freedom. The dictatorship will try more and more to drive Switzerland into its clutches with ever more insidious, harsher and more harassing measures, as well as slowly and forcibly. And if the Swiss people and their leaders will not be vigilant enough and allow themselves to be deceived by the EU dictatorship and maneuvered into its clutches, then a creeping loss of sovereignty will spread in Switzerland, as will an increasingly clear dependence on the Union dictatorship, which is becoming more and more stringent. But the fact will be that their sense of power will spread very quickly throughout Europe and will therefore also include Switzerland. Then it will also come about, if those responsible for the country and the reasonable part of the population do not think about freedom and peace, do not defend themselves against the dictatorial demands and measures of the dictatorship and do not reject them, that in the course of time the increasingly totalitarian Union dictatorship will deceitfully mislead Switzerland and its population with lies and deceit and integrate them into the dictatorship. So it is once again to be warned in advance that the whole thing will also apply to Switzerland if, as a result of ignorance, irrationality and irresponsibility on the part of those who govern and negotiate with the dictatorship, and of that unconscious part of the people who flirt with the dictatorship, the repressive demands of the Union dictatorship are met. Switzerland and its population would thus be financially exploited and increasingly harassed and deprived of independence by Union dictatorship laws and their rules, ordinances and regulations. This would be the case if the untraveled negotiators and the unneeded part of the people let themselves be blinded by the Union's dictatorship, and if they would submit to the insidious demands of the Union's dictatorship against the will of the people by means of anti-liberty resolutions, unfair treaties and constraints. Only if the Swiss people counteract this action by those responsible but irresponsible rulers who negotiate with the dictatorship by means of popular resolutions can it be prevented in the coming third millennium from ending Switzerland as a vassal state of the Union dictatorship. So, as in the whole world, if Switzerland and its people do not act with reason and understanding against the unfree and subjugating demands and insidiousness of the Union dictatorship, an unsatisfactory state between it, the Swiss population and the dictatorship will develop in Switzerland as well. So everything will go on as it has been since time immemorial and will take on even worse forms because very many people of this world will become unstoppable, and the longer, the more terribly brutalized, the more unrelated, indifferent and violent they will become to one another, which will result as an inevitable consequence of the ever faster growing world population, through which enormous problems of many kinds arise, which already at the time of the next millennium change can no longer be controlled. It will also result in the flight of peoples with streams of refugees, brutality, conscience and widespread violence, murder and manslaughter, ever-increasing crime and rampant crime, as well as discord, multiple murders and acts of violence in families. Also in the future extremely malicious religious aberrations will arise, which have appeared again and again since time immemorial and have led to fanatical wars of faith, but which in the coming times will continue to break out again and take on inhuman, brutal and murderous forms, which will be worse than all brutality and inhumanity, as everything in this still prevailing global war has emerged from the Nazi delusion. But in the times to come bloodthirsty and mostly religion, and thus faith-based terrorist organizations will increasingly brutally torture and murder hundreds of thousands of people worldwide, as this has already been done for thousands of years, when these degenerations have arisen from delusions of faith and the resulting persecution of believers of other faiths, and which will also be continued in the future. Every religion, as well as every deity, corresponds to a delusion of faith, which is not of a god, but, like the god himself, an improvised improvisation invented by human beings, which has arisen or is newly created by imagination, by a fantasy, by desires and a need for something higher. But every god and every religion does not correspond to a guardian power that protects the good, but deities and religions are the protectors and guardians of evil, which protects all evils and constantly promotes them, nourishes them, and further advances all horrors, wars, deaths, destruction, and all corruption. Everything that corresponds to deities and religions of faith, and everything that results from it, corresponds to fundamental misconceptions that blind and confuse the intellect and reason of men, let them fall into delusions and make them subservient in faith and dependent on it. Thereby every religion and every faith connected with it, and thus every belief in God in general, damages the clear-thinking ability of man, whereby his self-confidence, self-esteem and the self-determination and self-responsibility, which are clear to the mind and conditioned by reason, are blunted, suppressed and finally wiped out and destroyed. But humans are not abstract beings who live outside the world, so they have to live with it and with everything that exists in it, because the world and the natural system given to it with all its manifold plant kingdom and all its manifold walking, flying, creeping and floating life forms is their area of life. And this world is the true reality as it was created by creation, which was or is not a God conceived by man, but the eternal, the entire infinity of the heavenly space. And this creation produced and produces no religion, no God and no faith, but only reality, truth, love and certainty, while men in their delusion created a wrong understanding of creation, a belief in God and confused religions to the contrary, because they had and continue to have wrong and confused ways of thinking. Religion and faith in God are the general delusions of the people of this world, but therefore also their general false consolation for their hardships, their misery and their suffering, but also their justification for all evil and all evils they do, including wars, murders, every killing, torture, destruction and rape, complete destruction, extermination and all forms of every possible exercise of violence. What directed because his delusional faith and his religion dominate him in such a way that he is not able to defend himself against it. Clear reason and conscious reason are so rotten in believers that they can no longer perceive reality and its truth and can also find no or hardly any possibility of saving the rest of what still exists from insane reason and clear reason. In principle, the faithful are so controlled by their faithfulness that they are deaf, blind and rejecting in their delusion of faith in relation to the effectively real reality and are therefore also unable to grasp the factual truth. Everything corresponds to a religious and godly misery in an expression of real misery that works against understanding and reason in such a way that this vicious misery of faith in God and religion goes ever further and deeper, driving believers into ever more degenerate depravity, becoming ever more pathetic and oppressed sighing creatures. Degenerate creatures who selfishly see only themselves and their advantages, while the next one next to them becomes more and more an enemy to be hugged and killed. Every religion and the associated belief in God is poison for the self-realization of human beings, and furthermore religion and faith fuel an illusory, miserable happiness and a false security and contentment, which however are very far away from every reality. But with all these degenerations there will not be enough because everything will increase ever longer, ever more, will be carried far into the third millennium, and will constantly become more evil because these depravities, which are degenerately conceived and carried out as births of all evil and all evils of human sense, will bring mankind and the world to the brink of extermination and complete destruction. And this will become so if you do not listen to it and do not act according to what you will teach humanity through your work and also proclaim to it prophetically and predicatively. And in addition to the prevalence of all these and still many similar earthly human degenerations, there will also be the craving for money and profit, which will become completely uncontrollable. This will include the application of lethal poisons to the natural system to promote food growth and greater harvests, and to kill plant pests and inhibit or destroy weed species in growth, all of which, however, will in any sense be for profit. But many useful and even vital insects, as well as all kinds of mammals and other organisms important for the function of the natural system, as well as plants, will be poisoned, killed and exterminated, just as humans will also fall ill, suffer and die as a result of the poisons, because all the toxins introduced into the natural system will be deposited in the food plants, the soil, many organisms, but also in the waters, harvest products, and also in those slaughter animals which also serve as food for humans. So far I have to explain the necessary things to you today, but I will continue to teach you about this several times, because there will still be many facts and events in the near and further future to be revealed to you.